I'll introduce myself. For a long time, I worked at tech companies like Google and Twitter. I found myself actually sort of intrigued by going to work at big technology companies, largely because, as is consistent with the discussions tonight, I was obsessed with workplace culture. I was obsessed with dynamics of effective organizations. And I'll be honest with you, the day I got a job at Google, I thought I was sort of going into the chocolate factory. I was going into where the magic was made, where the organization that has cracked workplace culture, I was going to go and see how it happened. And spoiler, it wasn't that good. And so I was really intrigued, actually. There's a whole load, when it comes to workplace culture, there's a whole load of mythology, maybe deliberately so. You know, like quite often you go to big tech firms and there'll be a meeting room that looks like Star Wars, or there's a meeting room that looks like a scene from Jungle Book, and you think, I'll get my phone out, I'll take a photograph of this, and you've done their job for them. You've created sort of a tiny little fragment of branding for them. When I first went to work for Google, there was something very famous that was in the IPO document of Google that was 70-20-10. It was how their culture was completely different to everyone else. 70-20-10 was talked everywhere, it was all the time, and it was the idea that 70% of your job would be the main job that you were hired for, and then 20% of your time was on a project that you agreed with your boss, and then 10% of your time was on a project that you didn't even have to tell anyone. It was so secret. It was your little secret mission. And I'll be honest with you, I waited till I passed my probation before I started digging too much. But I was really surprised at how little I was hearing about 70-20-10 inside the company. Everyone was asking me externally. And eventually I tracked down an engineer and I said to him, do you do 20% time? He said, oh yeah, absolutely, 20% time. We call it Saturday. And I realised that, like, a lot of technology companies love telling you a myth about their culture, and it's not always the case. So I became obsessed, fascinated with these things. And the thing I've spent a lot of my energy on over the last couple of years, I left Twitter a couple of years ago, and I've spent the time since researching and writing the book that I'm incredibly grateful that a number of you, I don't know if everyone, has been given the book today. I just want to talk to you briefly about this. And the book really is an exploration of the resilience industry, really, and an exploration of how, firstly, this word has sprung up and this word presents itself to us, and why so many people find themselves unable to connect with the interventions that are created. It's a strange thing if you sort of try to imagine my flow of putting a book like this together. I found myself mid-lockdown, where you weren't allowed to see people for 3 months at a time. And my partner has sustains a degree of detachment from getting too involved. So I'd meet people for my mandated walk once every 3 months. I'd tell them I was writing a book on resilience, and they rolled their eyes. And then I went back and why did they roll their eyes? Why would people roll their eyes? Because, as someone told me, I got sent on a resilience course and it didn't work. And now I'm scared to tell my boss that the resilience course didn't make me any more resilient. That's interesting, isn't it? So the guy who came around to fix my Wi-Fi, he said there's sometimes there's like incredible wisdom in the little things that people say to you. He said, never in the history of calming down has someone calmed down by being told to calm down. And I think along the same lines, never in the history of resilience has someone become more resilient by being told to be more resilient. So the challenge of the talk about resilience is that it's full of misdirection and hero stories and elements that we might find ourselves sort of scratching our head and saying, okay, but beware of what's written there. Specifically, I'll give you a specific example. When you talk about resilience, someone will say, what about Simone Biles? What about ... What about some big sports star? So let me tell you, because that became an obsession for me, disabusing some of the stories. And to a large extent, it goes to go into that mythology helps us to understand some of the things that have been talked about today. So what I found was resilience was something that quite often was being used as a sticking plaster by toxic cultures. and it's a form of victim blaming. I found myself in Beirut. My partner's Lebanese, and we were in Beirut a couple of years ago when there was this massive explosion. If you've not seen it, YouTube it, and it'll sort of make you gasp. It's astonishingly fast. The third biggest explosion on a city ever. And you can probably guess the first two from the Second World War. It's got this phenomenal explosion. But the next day, the thing that struck me when I'd already had my spider senses tingling about the way that we use the word resilience, I noticed that all the coverage the next day said, well, if we know anything, the BBC said, if we know anything, the Lebanese people are resilient. New York Times said, anyone who's met a Lebanese person will know they are resilient people. And yet I was on the ground in Beirut and everyone was saying, man, we're so fed up of being told we're resilient. We just want someone to help us. We just need help from the world. So in that spirit, you know, I wonder if we could sort of reset our perspective of resilience. And I want to try and see if I can persuade you on why there's something more to it. But let me start with those rumours that were told. And there's some intriguing detail that we can delve into it. So UK Sport conducted a piece of work about 10 years ago. UK Sport is the organisation that puts competitors at the Olympic Games, British athletes at the Commonwealth Games, puts them on podiums. That's the goal. They really speak passionately about how much money does it cost us to get a gold medal. And so one of the things they did is they said, let's build a psychoanalytical profile of the people who go to games and win gold medals. And here's the intriguing thing about it. So they gathered a group of what they called super elite athletes. These are people who've gone to Olympic Games and come back with a gold medal. And they looked at them and they said, while they anonymized them in the data, they said, these people are household names. I suspect anytime an Olympics Games comes around, these are the people probably doing the analysis, the commentary. You see them on Saturday night TV. They're that big. And they compared them to people who'd gone to the Olympic Games and come back with maybe nothing or a bronze medal at best. And they called those elite athletes, so super elite and elite. What they discovered was something intriguing, and it's something that, you know, might then fill the stories, the mythology that we sometimes then have to knock down. What they found was 100% of the athletes who'd come back with a gold medal reported a significant moment of childhood trauma, normally linked to a moment of sporting success. Of those that they compared them to, only a quarter of them had had something comparable. Right. Now, in that story, if you told that story unvarnished, you could potentially say there is a resilient switch, there is a resilient gene, but it's far more complicated than that. Firstly, I want to emphasize something that we've touched on a bit during the course of the evening tonight, and I suspect, you know, people who find themselves in this room are probably familiar with some of this stuff. But we know unequivocally from a vast amount of empirical data that trauma does not correlate with triumph. You know, anyone who's familiar with the the Adverse Childhood Experiences Index will know this, that broadly the genius of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Index is that in a very simple methodology, it's a series of 10 questions, or sometimes when it's adapted 15, 16 questions, we can try to take an estimation of an individual's childhood experience. It's an approximate tool, it's a research tool, but you're asked simple questions that you're able to give a very simple yes or no answer to. And by giving a yes or no answer and only revealing your score at the end, you're able to give a physician, a doctor, some estimation of your life experience without being specific on details. You're asked before the age of 18, were you subjected to emotional humiliation? Were you subjected to physical abuse, sexual abuse? Did you live with someone who had addiction problems, someone who was incarcerated? Did you live with domestic abuse? I've given you 6 of them. There's 10 other questions. You're able to produce a score. Now, these scores, in fact, to score on this index is incredibly common. Most people can score at least 1. A large number of people can score, I think about 30-40% of people can score 4. But what was discovered was if you have an ACE score of 4, your life outcome massively changes. If you've got an A score of 4, I've got an A score of 4. If you've got an A score of 4, your likelihood of getting cancer in your lifetime doubles. Your likelihood of getting heart disease doubles. Your chance of having educational problems at school goes up 33 times. If you've got an A score of 6, the average population of the US prison system has an A score of 6. Your life expectancy is 20 years lower. You're 55 times more likely to have addiction problems. So these things, really interestingly, give us a clear pointer. Trauma does not lead to triumph. And so then the question becomes, okay, so what is going on? And what you find is that normally people who experience trauma experience it as in a certain pattern. They experience it as like a decimation of their sense of self, that their identity has been deleted. The average person who experiences trauma, broadly to sort of generalize it, they experience it as shame. Now, sometimes one of those ACE scores is that, did your parent pass away? Why on earth would you experience that as shame? But the mind plays unfortunate tricks on us. But the consequence of it is that when you get a rare intersection of this supreme sporting talent and someone whose sense of self has been demolished, they often find that sport becomes their redemptive identity. So, you know, in the way that we might see patterns of addiction being powered by this void inside people, similarly we see similar with elite athletes. It's a distraction. It deceives us. But what we see is addictive behavior. What you find is in the sporting analysis, you find that people who are elite sports, people who are the super elite, they say their life became an obsession. It was just sport and nothing else. As I was trying to research my book, while the work into athletes is anonymised in the Great British Medalist Report, we can see stories like Mo Farah's. Mo Farah's story was an enigma to me. You know, it was just a story of an immigrant come to the UK and done well. In fact, what we learned 3 or 4 months ago is Mo Farah was a victim of human trafficking. He was a victim of child slavery. And now his story makes sense. That someone who was a supreme competitor, a supreme athlete, but he filled the void inside of him with an obsessive focus on elite sport. So, look, while there's not really a teachable lesson in that, I think for the majority of us, that, you know, this is a distraction. It gives you an indication of the power of one thing. And Kelly Holmes mentions it there. Kelly Holmes was put in a children's home. She was eventually readopted by her mother. She experienced a lifetime of abuse, racial abuse in the village she lived in. But she says this one thing. She said, sport became my identity. And in that, you see the first pillar of where we find a model where actually we can understand where resilience comes from. I'll tell you this specifically now, because actually when we talk about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Index, the one thing that it proves most powerful is understanding our experience does not necessarily represent who we are, is one of the most powerful ways that the treatments for these conditions has improved. I mentioned that life expectancy can be impacted by these things, that addiction can be created by these things. But in fact, what we learn is that the more an individual can understand their situation, all of those things can be overcome. I think there might be a quote I put at the end, or I might not have put at the end, by a guy called Jack Shonkoff, who runs the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University, probably the leading place that they look at these things. And he says the one thing the science about this tells us is that actually your life experience does not necessarily predetermine your life outcome. So understanding the route that identity plays is really critical there. And there's elements to this. You know, you see elements of it where people who go through that relentless focus on their identity sometimes struggle. Naomi Osaka for a long time was the world's top tennis player, and she gave an interesting statement. She said this: "Who am I if I'm not a tennis player?" Simone Biles, the gymnast, I'm not sure if you know Simone Biles, but she said something similar just around the Olympics. She had like this sort of faltering Olympic Games. She was sort of odds on to go and win dazzling number of Olympic gold medals, and she sort of faltered. And she said, you know, the big question I've asked of myself is, if I'm not successful, what is my identity? Who am I? But so, you know, if identity is a critical component, there's another couple of components for understanding resilience and really intuiting it. And I think the thing that I would really try to emphasize is that the way that we've been instructed to think about resilience is as an individual trait. And for the vast majority of individuals, it proves very difficult to connect with. In fact, it's far more complicated than that. I'll go on and give you a perspective on this. Probably the biggest predictor of anything to do with well-being is a sense of personal control. And you might recognise this. If you open your calendar on a Monday morning and you've got back-to-back meetings all day, or actually, if that's your life, you open your calendar on a Sunday night and you've got back-to-back meetings tomorrow, and there's like sort of an anxious knot develops inside you. You're like, well, then you sit down at work and an email comes in. You're like, how am I meant to get this done? How am I meant to do this? What we know is really clearly that absence of control is one of the biggest things that impacts our personal well-being. And we see really clear examples of it, often to the extent that we might be confounded by what we see. You find situations where you can track the well-being, the stress levels, the health predictors of individuals. If they choose to work longer hours, if they choose to stay on and do an extra shift, the agency that they had in doing that seems to be protecting of them. So you can track nurses who are working 16-hour shifts, but the nurses amongst them who chose to stay for another 4 hours, their well-being and their stress levels are more healthy than those who were forced to do it. There's an element of control that plays a part. And I'll show you this. Till the age of 16, I was a member of an anti-vivisection, an anti-animal experiments organisation. I used to go and protest against things. Now I'm going to show you an experiment that took place on rats. Look at me. But I want to show you because I think this is a really interesting example. It's grim. The guy who did this research promises this is the last one of these bits of research that he did. But by God, what a way to go out. He did this thing where I don't know who comes up with this. They gave cancer tumours to rats, and the way that they talk about these cancer tumours, they say these have a lethality rate of 50%. So you guessed it, half of the rats who get this cancer tumour die. The next thing they did, I think that's a pretty bad start. Next thing they did is they said, now we're going to mess with the rat's environment. And I think what this gives you, this grim little peek into conditions gives you, is it gives you an insight into, even all things considered, our circumstances make things worse. So what they did is they put rats into a cage where 18 times a day they were subjected to an electric shock. You've already given him cancer. Give him a break. 18 times a day. Half of the rats were given the opportunity that there was a little bar that they touched it, the shock would stop. So they were described as being in a controllable situation. Okay. Now, what was discovered was that even though you've given 50% of the rats this lethality, and in fact, the monitoring the control group, the typical control group, half of them died. You found something different. The ones who had control over their environment, interestingly, that sense of agency, that sense that they were able to have some impact on their environment, seemed to mitigate some of the impact. Only a quarter of those died. The ones who were in the electric shocks, and you just go grin and bear it and put up with it, more than them, they were described as a helpless state, more of them died. It's astonishing how consistently we see this. In fact, the tragedy of this is this. The less control that a parent has in their job, the more likely in the research they are to be controlling of their kids. The biggest predictor of whether someone is a bully at school is whether they've got a domineering parent. These things not only have an impact on our well-being, but they have an impact on the way that we conduct ourselves, that the way we carry ourselves. So this impact on our environment is by far the biggest predictor of personal well-being. But if we're going to get, so, you know, it plays a part, and we've got to consider the part that plays in terms of resilience. If we're looking at colleagues, and colleagues are showing signs of feeling out of control, a feeling that they're beset with anxiety, then we might say, do they feel like they've got any agency to do their job? Do they feel like they've got any scope to make decisions in their environment? It's a big predictor. But the final part, by none, of resilience is the most critical part. And broadly, the way that I would describe resilience, you know, I sort of call the book Fortitude merely because the whole term of resilience has been so heavily appropriated, is this part. Broadly, if I was going to give any summary of resilience as it truly exists to anyone, resilience is the strength we draw from each other. And I want to give you some examples specifically of how that's the case. Broadly, Artie talked before about great organisational culture, and good organisations have a sense that we're all in it together. And broadly, that's what we find is the origin of resilience. And I want to give you some really clear, specific evidence of where that's the case. We feel resilient when we feel supported and defended by people around us. I always think in this instance right now, I always think if you want a sense of we're all in it together, then, you know, it's hard not but to be dazzled by people in Ukraine. There's sort of the sense that people maybe on a Friday were told that, you know, you either had to flee the country or you had to take up arms, and yet the sense that people had this strong collective bond seems to have empowered them to do things that we couldn't remotely believe possible. So as you start seeing that, and there was talk earlier, I don't know whether it was Dr. Nick who said it, but talk about me and we. As soon as you start seeing the protective quality of we, then you recognise it everywhere. I always think in this instance, you'll remember right at the start of the Ukraine situation, President Zelensky stood and said, we're all here. This is the Ministry of Defence. This is the Ministry of Health. We're all here. And I always think that in contrast, Vladimir Putin's long table. I don't think this evokes a strong sense of we're all in it together, personally. And what you find is that actually it's not just the people of Ukraine. We see repeated instances. I'll give you one really dazzling example for me. There was a really interesting piece of work, I think Dr. Nick mentioned, about the mental health crisis that has been represented by the pandemic. But the really interesting thing is the world's leading expert into teenage well-being is a woman called Jean Twenge. And she's written very extensively about the impact of mobile phones and social media. She wrote an article that was in the Atlantic magazine about 3 or 4 years ago that was titled How Smartphones Destroyed a Generation. So she pulls no punches. She's got strong opinions on it. But the really interesting thing is if you look into her data right at the start of the pandemic, something sort of dazzling and confusing comes out of it. She looked at that. So, right, we've got to rewind the clock. Remember that first stage. You're in. That's it. You're not allowed out. You're not even allowed to sit on a bench when you go out. You remember that stage? You're queuing outside Aldi to buy a 4-pack of Cochelles. You're going to buy some pasta fusilli. If someone's foraging for tomato sauce to mix it with, and you gather every evening around the kitchen table, and that was the critical thing. What Jean Twenge discovered, that teenagers in the pandemic who sat down and had a family meal with their family, their depression went down and their resilience went through the roof. Resilience is the strength we draw from each other, and understanding that a sense of connectedness and we-ness is the most protective thing gives us a really important pointer. Another couple of examples. I always say, if anyone is remotely interested in workplace culture, this is by far the best book. It'll cost you about £8 on Amazon, and it's by far the best investment. Superficially, you'll think it's not relevant to you because it's about supermarkets, about retail stores. And the woman who wrote it is a professor of operations from MIT. And she's got no interest in workplace culture. She's got no interest in sort of the psychology, the dynamics. But she discovered an interesting piece of data, that organizations that give their workers good workplace conditions were significantly faster growing, were significantly more profitable, and their stock performed better. And so while she had no interest, it's called The Good Job Strategy by Zeynep Ton. People who are trying to crane to see it. Zeynep Ton, The Good Job Strategy. And she found herself sort of thinking, okay, there's something in this. I must go and have a look at this. And she went and she does a very simple analysis of why these organizations are more profitable. It gives 4 clear reasons of what they do for their workers that's transformational. But I loved this quotation from it, because if you start believing that a sense that we're all in it together is the defining thing that not only characterizes good workplace cultures, but seems to characterize resilient organizations, then I love this quotation. Quick Trip is a US... In the book, she looks at European supermarkets, Australian supermarkets, American ones. Quick Trip is an American one. And this is the senior vice president of operations. He says the number one reason people stay with Quick Trip is not the money. And just to emphasize, they pay 50% over the market average. It's because the managers will do the same job as they will do. The quotation goes on to say the managers will clean the toilets. They've never worked anywhere where the manager will wipe down workstations. They've never worked anywhere that the manager will come and take deliveries. Now, I suspect the manager doesn't do that all of the time, but it's the sense that everyone's in it together is strongly communicated by that. I'll give you one final example of how protective it is. I'm really intrigued, that Ukraine example is one illustration, but the more we look into the international context of this, you see it everywhere. I chatted to someone who's just been deployed with the United Nations in the Caribbean, and he said the first thing that UN looks at in its reports is social cohesion, the sense that we as a nation we're all in it together. But most of the best work that I found on this is work into social identity. It's by a guy called Alex Haslam, and this is a piece of work that he did studying Australia. He studied the elections in Australia in the history of Australian democracy, 120 years. He went through all of the speeches, and he said 80% of the time, the people who won Australian elections were the people who used the words we and us more. That sense that we're all in it together is such a powerful leadership tool. It's such a powerful way to build strong cultures, and yet we often neglect it. I saw someone in the newspapers describing the downfall of Boris Johnson, saying that the challenge for him was that the moment he went from appearing to be one of us to looking like one of them was the moment where he starts losing connection with an audience. It's like a really fascinating way to reframe it. I'm just going to end on a couple of specific points. This is one thing that I think is directly relevant. So if the hypothesis I've tried to suggest is that while there are elements of resilience that are all about owning our strong sense of identity, and actually I think it was Artie who talked about resource groups, that's a really critical component of that. Celebrating people's sense of identity is really critical. In fact, it's so incredibly powerful. One of the things that you observe is that it has a measurable impact on people's sense of well-being. There's a really heartbreaking piece of research right from the start of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, conducted by an American physician who was trying to understand at the time what was HIV/AIDS. It took them a while to understand it. And one of the things that was first done was that they started tracking individuals to try and work out the onset of this condition and what happened. The remarkable thing that happened was that men who were openly gay, broadly the people they were looking at were HIV positive men in San Francisco. This is what the study. Men who were openly gay to their family and friends seemed to have better health outcomes than those who were not openly gay to their family and friends. In fact, to the extent that, and it's a really tragic piece of research to read, the men who concealed their identities from their family and friends more quickly descended into having full-blown AIDS and had a much higher mortality rate. I mean, it's heartbreaking to read the research, but it just gives you an indication that these things aren't merely trivial. They actually, anything that celebrates identity, whether it be Black History Month, whether it be Pride, whatever these things are, they aren't remotely trivial. They seem to have a material impact on people's sense of well-being. So I want to talk, the final thing though, if I've given you this pillar of resilience, which is identity, and given you this important foundation, which is a sense of personal control, if I'm saying to you that the most critical element of resilience is a sense of connectedness, that this resilience is the strength we draw from each other, I think there's a couple of teachable moments that any of us can think about in organizations. And I take this word here. This is a Hebrew word. And in fact, someone mentioned Yom Kippur or something yesterday, and this is a Hebrew word. it came into contact with me from a beautifully thoughtful talk by the former chief rabbi of the UK, a guy called Jonathan Sacks, a man who sort of transcended his role. He was an incredibly thoughtful thinker, really, sort of gave a lot of thoughts. And he talked about this word, simha. People will correct my pronunciation on that, but simha, a hard ha sound in the middle. Okay, simha, ha. Okay. Anyway, this word is translated, when we translate from Hebrew into English, as joy. But Jonathan Sacks says, actually, he says it's more than that. This means shared joy. Now, that's a really interesting distinction, because I guess most of us would know moments that we were happy, but moments of shared joy have got something special to them. And he said specifically they really have got something special. He talked about how, the things that pass our culture down are often these moments of shared joy, rituals of connection and celebration. He said if we think about our favourite times of any year, our favourite times with any person, they're often characterised by moments of simha, of feeling connected with other people. Now, I think there's something that elevates beyond an understanding of religion, of connection, of society. Any of us can think about the relevance of that for the moment we're in right now. In a working environment, if we say that resilience is about the strength we draw from each other, then it's not impossible to look at the situation that a lot of us have found ourselves in over the course of the last 2 years and say, yeah, we feel less connected. We feel like we feel like we're doing work in a more individualistic way. Work has gone from being something like school, where it was like tightly knit and a real gang mentality, to something like college, which is a bit disparate. We do our work in our own time. These aren't necessarily my best friends in the world that I study with. We've got a slightly different relationship. And actually, if any of us are going to think about building cultures that are really strongly focused on a sense that we're all in it together, then these moments of simha, these moments of connection, these moments of shared joy are probably a really important thing for us to think about. I was really struck. I revisited something that I'd studied a couple of years ago, and I was reminded. I went into one organisation that the receptionist had changed the culture. And I love things like that, because it just gives us a reminder that culture is democratic, that we can all play a part in it. We don't need it to be passed down to us. And this receptionist changed the culture. She said, basically, she was a resting actor. She used to come to this organisation between jobs. And she said to someone aside on a Thursday afternoon, "This is the worst place I've ever worked in." That's good. Thank you for your feedback. But be sure to press the emoji button as you leave, the smiling face button as you leave. And she said, "This is the worst place." And no one did anything. So the following week, she went out at lunchtime. She bought 4 cans of Pringles, 4 bags of kettle chips. She laid them all out on a paper plate in the middle of the table. And she said, sent an email around the company saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's the best time of the week. It's Crisp Thursday." Now, then she persisted with it. First week, people thought, "What's this? This is weird." Second week, people came along and said, "Oh yeah, we did this again. Still don't know why." Third week, she was in a Pringles can. She was dressed up as a. By the 4th week, people were saying, "Are you going to be at Crisp Thursday? I'll meet you there. I'll go and have a chat." And interestingly, what is it? It's a moment of simha. It's a moment of shared joy. People said it became their favourite part of the week. A new chief exec started. Someone said, "Is someone going to tell him about Crisp Thursday?" Because they were kind of scared. They didn't want to lose it. Rituals are the way that we pass down culture. And I think, there's a critical lesson about all of this. There's moments when any of us might read something about resilience or imagine that the world's less resilient. And actually, if we started to think about those teenagers in the pandemic, if we started to think about the people in Ukraine, if we started to think about Crisp Thursday, if we started to think about those moments, knowing that when we feel connected, supported, understood by the people around us, it's the thing that gives us access to resilience. It transforms the perspective. It's no longer someone who says, "I've been on a resilience course and it didn't work and I'm scared to tell anyone." Now we go, "I get it. I really understand. I need to sort of make sure that I feel seen and supported by the people around me." So a fundamental reappraisal. Like I say, I've given you a perspective of those things. It became an obsession for me because we're so frequently surrounded with discussions of resilience. And like I say, it ends up with being a degree of victim blaming where people feel like I've just had a really bad situation, and now I'm being told, like the people of Beirut, now I'm being told that it's a sign that I'm a good person if I can get back off my knees, and it's a sign if I'm a failure that I can't. And I think the more that we understand with empathy and we seek to understand the true origins of resilience, I think will be much more useful to the people we work with, and I think we'll be able to access it more fully ourselves. Thank you very much.